Well, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Vicki. Good afternoon, everyone. I just always in these moments, I just wish we could be together in person because I know you had an incredible experience this morning with Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, also for being there. And then I'm also grateful for this ability for us to be able to talk and communicate together in this way. So thank you, everyone, for coming out for this day. A special thank you to Vicki Penner and Jermaine Pennington for inviting us to join Prairie View for your recognition that history matters. I want to also stick in a quick thank you to Colin Manson, because there's no way we could do all this tech without you. So Colin and your team, thank you very much. Your recognition of history mattering, you're not only doing this by celebrating the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Anabaptist movement, a deep and important legacy, but also by facing the underside of history, the toxic human behavior that has shaped our past and thus also our present. It's an honor that you are using our book as one tool for equipping folk to face and heal haunted histories, which keep inhabiting our personal and political consciousness, thus inhibiting our attempts to build a more human and just future for all. In this presentation, we'll give you some glimpses of the book's content, and we want to invite you to really focus on the words and images on the screen as well as what we are saying. So first, we are beaming in from the town of Oakview, halfway up the Ventura River watershed in Southern California bioregion, where we live and work with Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries in the heart of traditional unceded and untreated Chumash territory, where colonization began in 1782 with the establishment of Mission San Buenaventura, the ninth of the 21 Franciscan missions.
Only 7 people
as settlers are responsible to the violent legacy of colonization here. And we understand our Christian discipleship to be the work of healing wounds in our place and people in order to more deeply realize God's vision of beloved community here. And healing haunted histories lies at the center of this commitment. We open this book with a commissioning from our greatest American prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., articulated in his 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait, over 60 years ago. This passage is a profound diagnosis of our national dis-ease of denial about the shadow side of our past. And King summarizes the task of healing haunted histories precisely. He writes, "For too long, the depth of racism in American life has been underestimated. The surgery necessary to extract it is complex and detailed. As a beginning, we must x-ray our history and reveal the full extent of disease." King then, without equivocation, named the origins of this disease, the dispossession and murder of indigenous peoples. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. Even today, King continued, most white settler Americans have not morally reckoned with this shameful history. He concluded by acknowledging that those of us who do desire to liberate ourselves from this tangled web of prejudice have not yet fully grasped how deeply it has been woven into our consciousness. What an extraordinarily courageous and prescient diagnosis.
Healing Haunted Histories offers a framework for x-raying our personal and political histories as settlers, and to encourage, challenge, and capacitate Christians and other people of faith and conscience to understand how our histories, landscapes, and communities are haunted by the long and continuing history of indigenous dispossession wrought by settler colonialism, to transform the self-understanding lifeways and structures we inhabit and reproduce, and to practice restorative solidarity with indigenous communities as part of a wider movement of decolonization. We call this work a discipleship of decolonization. You can call it a discipline if that's too religious. The root is the same. And in the next 40 minutes, we're going to try to summarize some of its salient points, which we hope those of you who now have the book might explore further. Sociologist Avery Gordon, she's out here on the West Coast, in her important 1997 book, Ghostly Matters, asserts that haunting is a constituent element of modern social life, through which repressed or unresolved social violence makes itself known in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, slavery, for instance, or when their oppressive nature is continuously denied. Importantly, Gordon also emphasizes how reckoning with these ghosts can mobilize individual, social, or political movement and change, but only if they are faced. In the same vein, Eve Tuck and C. Ree also name settler colonialism, which they define succinctly as the management of those who have been made killable, as the oldest haunted history in North America, making the same point as me. Indeed, a half millennium of colonization has left a legacy of violation and genocide that inhabits every intersection of settler and indigenous worlds past and present, which is deeply woven into the fabric of our inner and outer lives. Unless and until this legacy is faced and healed, they assert, there will always be more ghosts to return. We use this notion of haunting as a springboard for our work because it speaks both to the political and the personal, the psychological and the spiritual, things past and present.
Here's a pointed example of a contemporary haunting. Shortly after our book was published, several First Nations in Canada began reporting unmarked grave sites that had been discovered near the location of former Indian residential schools. Sites were uncovered in Kamloops, British Columbia, and then shortly after in Saskatchewan, where I grew up. These grim unearthings animated protests. For example, ghostly small red handprints and the lament, "We were children," scrawled on the front door of the Catholic Cathedral in Saskatoon. Kids' shoes and toys were placed on the steps there and at countless other churches. Such uncoveries compel those of us who are Canadian to confront the colonial settler policy of forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples by removing children from their homes to schools run, in most cases, by churches. There, abuses occurred that seeded intergenerational trauma among survivors, as the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Committee hearings so dramatically revealed a decade ago. Of course, you know that this same drama is played out in the United States, which also ran such schools, again, often administered by churches. And we learned from Michelle Armster that the Indian Mission Industrial School in Halstead, Kansas, was a missionary, quote, missionary project of the Mennonite Church, where stories of abuse have yet to be reckoned with. Former Interior Secretary under Joe Biden, Deb Haaland, Laguna Pueblo, began a search for unmarked graves at boarding school sites across the U.S. And she was doing great work, and of course, sadly but unpredictably, this has been shut down by the current administration.
The truth is, hauntings are everywhere. In California, as a teenager, my family used to camp along the Gaviota coast northwest of Santa Barbara, which was and is the heart of Chumash country. We often set up in Tahigua's Canyon, the former site, I learned later, of the Chumash village of Tahigua. There was an old coast live oak not far from our campsite that bore this arbor glyph, dating to the early 1800s. It appears to be a Chumash rendering of a neophyte, that is, someone forcibly taken into the Spanish mission system, kneeling before a Franciscan padre to receive communion. This Indian tree, as it was called, was my first exposure to the heavy footprint of Spanish colonization of California, though it took years for me to awaken to the real story of missionization as colonization. So this fading photo has hung on my wall for decades. Haunting reminds me daily the need for we, people of faith, to face our conflicted legacies. And of course, your part of the country has its share of hauntings, starting with how the Kanza, Pawnee, Osage, Potawatomi, Wichita, and other indigenous communities were pushed off their lands by settlers throughout the mid-19th century. Michelle reminds us that the building of the railroad had particular impact, both in terms of the mass killing of buffalo and bison, over 1 million, which was central to Plains Indian culture, and how railroads sold off their surplus land to settlers, including many Mennonites, thus obscuring the newcomers' role in indigenous dispossession. For the notorious regional land rushes of the late 19th century, such as this one in Oklahoma in 1893, further opening up the indigenous lands to whichever settlers got there first. And there are specific hauntings, such as the massacre at Cheyenne Hole on April 23, 1875, near modern-day Rawlins County, Kansas, in which U.S. soldiers killed 27 Cheyenne led by Little Bull who were trying to surrender. Or the Bleeding Kansas period of violence from 1854 to 1859, where pro-slavery and abolitionist settlers clashed over whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free or a slave state. This era saw violent confrontations, including a mob that destroyed parts of Lawrence in an attack led by a pro-slavery sheriff on an anti-slavery newspaper. Or the still unsolved case of the 2018 disappearance and then murder of Brittany Tiger in nearby Pontotoc County, Oklahoma, part of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls today. Whether or not we are conscious of these things, we carry them in our bones, in our psyches, and in our settler privileges. Fact is, regardless of our race and class, all non-Indigenous North Americans inhabit land that was stolen, and we are all complicit, a word which means to be entangled in the historical legacy of white supremacist institutions and policies, and in the ongoing afterlife of settler colonialism inside us and around us. Indigenous activist Nikki Sanchez puts it this way: history of settler colonialism is not your fault, but it's absolutely your responsibility.
Awakening our responsibility requires a journey deep into the layers of our personal and political captivity and conformity. We must pursue an archaeology of self and society and nurture the courage to feel the pain of our entanglement, past and present, and to heal. In particular, we white folks need to unburden Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color from the emotional labor of having to share their pain so we can understand the issues. Our work cannot be sustained on other people's pain, nor on their strength. We will continue to emphasize this because we know that it entails a radical break from our dominant American culture of denial, into which we have all been socialized. For centuries, settler communal stories, public discourses, and educational systems have disappeared or repressed voices that contradicted our self-congratulatory narratives. We white folks have become adept at avoiding personal and political responsibility, both regarding our public history and our family stories. And the current political climate is doubling down on this culture of denial. Here are two typical strategies of the many that we explore in our book. Agnosia is not amnesia, but collective acts of ignoring which are reinforced through our educational systems and the media. We think colonization is just too difficult to understand. We don't know, and we don't want to know. Not about the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, not about Wounded Knee in 1890, not about Standing Rock in 2017, and not about the legacy of Indian boarding. A second strategy is to aggressively dissociate ourselves from a past which is not our fault, and to be dismissive of those who seek to face and heal it. You know, the eye-rolling, the harumphing. We instead embrace an ahistorical individualism, understanding ourselves as free-floating entities, untethered and unaccountable. This has been called a transcendent denial, which makes us sick at heart and soul, unable to look at each other or ourselves without fear. You have doubtless encountered this psychic substrate in your work to help heal mental and emotional anguish and anxiety at Prairie. Our approach in this book concentrates on where and how the personal and political intersect. We invite readers to explore their family storylines, tracing and analyzing place, people, and spirit to name and heal the hauntings of colonization. Landlines are about mapping past and present geographies of inhabitation, to understand how we were shaped by and shapers of those places, for good and for ill, because the land holds the story. Bloodlines are about mapping family and community genealogies, including race and ethnicity, class, assimilation and erasure, and the trauma and moral injury from an entanglement in colonization that we carry in our bones, because our flesh holds stories. Something those of you trained in Bowen's family systems theory or trauma interventions offered by Peter Levine or Besser Van der Kolk will know well. And then songlines. These are about remembering and sustaining liberative traditions of faith, conscience, and solidarity that inspire practices of justice and compassion among our people. Because our spirit holds the story. We have found that this approach offers a way for regular people and institutions to grapple with issues they typically perceive as too big, too abstract, or too removed from our agency. Discovering, interrogating, and decolonizing our landlines, bloodlines, and songlines animates and empowers us to work towards practices of restorative solidarity. This is what the great writer-activist Audre Lorde called doing our own work. A discipleship of decolonization is about revisioning our people's stories mindfully, critically, and compassionately, including our own, with a commitment to healing, justice, and repair, and resisting temptations to shame on the one hand or exoneration on the other. And we use the metaphor of peeling an onion with all the accompanying tears. We long for our faith communities and mental health agencies to be places where settlers can nurture the courage to face and engage the many layers of entanglement in order to find both healing and justice. Because we have been socialized into cultures of denial, the task of reckoning with the historic and continuing wounds of settler colonialism is, for most of us settler descendants, an overwhelming proposition. But again, Bowen urged us to examine family patterns and behaviors passed down through generations. And increasingly, therapists are exploring the impact of intergenerational trauma and dysfunction. Our approach views every one of us as both object, so impacted by, and subject, impacting on these systems and their legacies. Colonialism is not something apart from our everyday lives, nor is it someone else's problem. We white settlers, as historic beneficiaries of this history and its legacy, have a particular responsibility to do this work. Sometimes our people were victims, sometimes perpetrators, even if unwittingly, sometimes both. But the diseased river of colonialism runs through every one of us, even when we denied it. And we think both our psychotherapeutic and particularly our religious traditions, because they are deeply implicated in this history of colonization, must also be held accountable. The heart of our book maps my family and communal storylines as primary demonstration field. Me doing my own work out loud. It is both unique and typical of settler narratives, and may resonate with some of you because of the Mennonite and or Prairie connection. I look at my Ruslander grandparents, their community's flight from Russia and Ukraine in the wake of Bolshevik and Stalinist violence, and then their settlement on the Canadian prairies in the 1920s. Going deeper, we explore how over the century, Anabaptist dissent, displacement, and periodic persecution marginalized our people on the one hand, but on the other, Mennonite leaders often became adept at negotiating certain privilegia from the colonial powers, which often implicated us in the colonial project while accelerating our assimilation into white advantages over time. In Saskatchewan, for example, traumatized Ruslander immigrants settled as Mennonite farmers who were actively recruited by the Canadian government as a buffer population to help, quote, domesticate the prairies. And they were given land grants that certainly benefited my ancestors. In the process, however, of course, nearby Indigenous communities suffering from far greater trauma because of ongoing colonial policies of dispossession and suppression were displaced. The result was that two haunted communities struggled to survive side by side, yet with little connection between them. Fortunately, due largely to Indigenous hospitality and activism and emerging Mennonite efforts at solidarity, this story is beginning to change, but we have a long way to go.
Doing this work means paying attention to issues of both intergeneral trauma and moral injury. Reverend Nelson Johnson, who passed earlier this year, may rest in peace, and Mother Joyce of the Greensboro, North Carolina Beloved Community Center are mentors, dear mentors of ours. When interviewing Nelson for our ambassador's book in 2007, in talking about the disease of racism, Nelson raised this poignant question. What horrors happened to white people in Europe, such that when they came to North America, they participated in the enslavement and displacement of other peoples based on their skin color? Psychotherapist Resba Manikin explores in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, also the European roots of the pathology of white supremacy, including no matter what we look like, if we were born and raised in America, white body supremacy and our adaptations to it are in our blood. Our bodies house the unhealed dissonance and trauma of our ancestors. That's why our approach, like that of many of you therapists, is to examine, revise, and transform the stories we live by, individually and collectively. Elaine and I are wary of the popular dilution and overuse of trauma language. Nevertheless, it's been firmly established that unresolved personal or historical trauma leads to more trauma. In Healing Hard Histories, we list 4 reasons for wrestling with trauma frameworks, including the fact that both Judaism and Christianity were born out of traumatic experiences and have resources to help us with resilience. We will look briefly at the transmission of intergenerational trauma on one hand and moral injury on the other. This will be familiar to many of you in this room. The intergenerational transmission of trauma has been documented in a wide range of cultural groups and communities who have experienced war, enslavement, genocide, and other political oppression. Studies show that trauma can be passed down through both nurture and nature.
For example, offspring of Holocaust survivors were more vulnerable to developing post-traumatic stress disorder just by witnessing their parents' chronic PTSD, including just from hearing about Holocaust-related events. Dr. Rachel Lev-Zell claims that trauma gets passed down as a family legacy whether or not survivors speak about it. I saw this in my research among Mennonites about trauma from Russia. Most subjects told of their parents' or grandparents' silence, while some described how their parents talked about violence they endured ad nauseum. Other research examines how PTSD impacts parenting styles. Survivors of the Khmer Rouge killing fields often exhibited role reversal parenting, in which a parent looks to a child to meet needs of intimacy or comfort, and the child attempted to meet those needs, often leading to anxiety in this next generation. Mennonite women who fled from Stalinist Russia in the 1940s often withheld intimacy from their children because they were so uncertain the family would survive. Lack of parental attachment leads to development trauma disorder in children. Epigenetics is a new field of study that looks at inherited alterations in gene function. Survivors of life-threatening experiences such as war, torture, enslavement, or famine can develop changes to the chemical coding of their chromosomes. This coding becomes a sort of cell memory, and this physiological footprint of trauma is passed on like other genetic characteristics. Other forms of biological transmission can occur as well. Pregnant mothers who witnessed the collapse of the World Trade Towers in September 2001 developed PTSD. And studies showed that in the first year of life, their babies also exhibited lower cortisol levels, which is correlated to increased risk of developing PTSD. Indigenous researchers describe how because of the persistent violation through centuries of colonization, from loss of territory to Indian residential schools to the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls today, trauma is synergistic. That is, more than the sum of its different episodes. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, Papa Oglala Lakota, a social worker and mental health expert, has developed theory and therapies by and for Indigenous peoples in North America. She writes about, quote, cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, its correlation to substance abuse and family breakdown, and how the historical trauma response is a constellation of features in reaction to massive group trauma, end quote. You can find the URL of her online presentation, The Return to the Sacred Path, Reflections on Development of Historical Trauma Healing, which is an excellent summary of the exemplary work of the Takini Institute. And sorry, you can find it on page 91 and 92 of Healing Context. Dr. Joy DeGruy names the African American experience of intergenerational trauma as PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome, a theory that explains the etiology of many of the adaptive survival behaviors in African American communities throughout the United States and the diaspora. PTSS is, quote, a consequence of multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants, resulting from centuries of chattel slavery, followed by institutionalized racism, which continues to perpetuate injury. Gerald Visner, Chippewa, coined the term survivance, survival plus endurance, to describe indigenous renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victory throughout history. These communities are showing us how people do move from being victims to survivors to healers. And so it is important for us settlers to support people of color doing this intense work, but also to do our own. For example, our ancestral experiences of trauma are often narrated selectively or altogether suppressed in communal as well as public narratives. Historian Marlene Epp showed how Mennonite women's experiences in Stalinist Russia were silenced and largely overshadowed by those of men. But there's also silences around our complicity, about indigenous displacement by Mennonite settlement, both in Ukraine and Russia, and then as well on Turtle Island. And there is silence around stories of historic cooperation, which also cuts against the grain of the dominant narrative regarding Indigenous people. Again, Epp, in her book, Mennonite Women in Canada, recovers tales of Indigenous women feeding, clothing, caring for, and healing children of early Mennonite settlers. So we ask, what are the silences in your family or community's narrative? What painful pieces have been suppressed, denied, delegitimized, or dismissed? And how does it feel to carry or break these silences? Mennonite therapist Carolyn Yoder has pointed out that often our Mennonite pain is so great that we are blind to how we harm or oppress others. Social psychologist John Mack called this egoism of victimization, where groups who have experienced trauma exhibit little empathy for others' losses, even if the victimization on the other side is palpably comparable to or greater than one's own. And we Mennonites must also recognize, settler Mennonites, our participation in adoption programs. An estimated 20,000 Indigenous children were part of the 60s scoop in Canada, removed from their families and communities and placed in foster homes or adopted, primarily by white middle-class families, including many Mennonites. And indeed, the AIM, Adopt Indian Métis program in Saskatchewan, was started by a Mennonite. Most of the adoptee families were never given any cultural training or told the communities that their adopted children came from. In January 2019, Premier Scott Moe apologized for Saskatchewan's role in the 60s scoop, culminating a process of political reconsideration of cultural genocide. There is still so much justice work and healing that needs to be done. An even newer field of study of those implicated in historical or current violence is looking at symptoms of moral injury. which can also be transmitted across generations. Moral injury is a particular type of trauma that may develop following a perceived moral violation where a person perpetrates, fails to prevent, or witnesses events that contradict deeply with their held moral beliefs and expectations. This is something that we white settlers must face and explore. The frameworks of both moral injury and what some call perpetrator-induced trauma syndrome are important for those of us whose ancestors cooperated and benefited from settler colonialism. And recent studies have shown how that moral injury is transmitted as intergenerational trauma. So the same ways we looked at trauma is how we understand how moral injury is transmitted.
So this is a sample worksheet from our new participants workbook for Healing Haunted Histories. It shows notes by a colleague who's done really deep work on landlines, bloodlines, and songlines concerning the ancestral history he carries. He's wrestling deeply with moral injury and responsibility back to the 17th century when his ancestors received land grants, took Roanoke land, and enslaved people. There's lots more we get into in the book, but let's turn now to ways of turning things around, which happens to be the biblical meaning of repentance, turning our personal and political histories around. How do we begin to address hauntings and injustices and work towards a discipleship of decolonization? The late Barbara Holmes, with whom we had the privilege of working closely, was in the struggle for justice and healing her entire life. A lawyer, theologian, mentor, and mystic. She reminds us that if we don't pick up this healing and justice, we're simply handing it off to the next generation. There is no response, she wrote, other than radical love that is up to the task of healing transgenerational wounds. But she warned, questions that lay on those inner altars and that receive no response in one generation are handed down to the next. Indeed, friends, we can kick the can of healing wounds and hauntings down the road, but we do so to our own great peril. As we're learning from things like climate crisis or racial and economic disparity or war, all of which repeatedly show us how unresolved traumas and moral injury threaten the very viability of future generations. And this denial is resurgent right now in the desperate swing back toward national innocence and white supremacy. We know that so far this has been an intense dive into heavy matters. So let's take a little breathing and a stretch break for 2 or 3 minutes. And Elaine's going to lead us.
And friends, this is not a bathroom break. So please, we're getting to the meat. We do not want you to leave. One thing you as mental health care professionals know is that we cannot think our way to healing from trauma or moral injury. The trauma response is stored in our bodies, and we need to use somatic practices to physically release it and work towards healing. During my doctoral studies, I was wrestling with all of these very, very painful issues, and so I dealt with my own body stress by apprenticing to a grassroots somatic healing program called Capacitar International. It teaches ancient somatic practices such as Tai Chi, finger holds, and emotional freedom tapping to help us regulate ourselves. So again, Chet is going to hold me to a brief 2-minute stretch break. So if you are willing to join us in this, afterwards we'll take about 12 more minutes to talk about reparative practices. So if you're willing, please stand with me, or you can do this from your chair. And we're just going to do one gentle body movement. And I want you to focus on your breath. Follow the simple body movement, breathe, and visualize release. Allow your body to move freely and fully without controlling your movement with your mind. All right, so here we go. Hey, Chad, you gotta. All right, I hope you can see me, and if you can. Let's start. Feet, again, you can do this from sitting if you're more comfortable, but stand if you want to stand with me, please do. Feet are shoulder width apart, knees are slightly bent, your core is strong, and we're just going to start with a gentle twisting motion and allowing your hands and arms to tap against your stomach and back and sides. And this one, I'm sorry, you can't really do from your chair. But what we're doing is actually tapping the places where our body stores anxiety and stress. And let's slowly bring that twisting movement to rest. And let's put one foot in front of the other, it doesn't matter which one, and our hands are up at our chest. And what we're going to do is we're going to push out. And as we push out, we breathe out. And as we rock back, we breathe in. So we breathe out, in. As we breathe out our stress and anxiety, and breathe in healing and peace. Out, in. And one more on this side, out, and in. And then let's bring the other foot forward. And here, as we breathe out and in, breathe out that which is stuck and wounded. Breathe in strength and determination. Out all that is stuck. In, and one more time. Out and in. Thank you, friends. And if you need to do a little bit more stretching before you sit down, please feel free to do that. Thank you. We'll keep going, so we try to stay a little bit on time. I found these practices to be incredibly healing. It's a wonderful training out here in Southern California, although I know she travels. Her name is Pat Kane. Please consider attending it if you're interested.
That's the website.
The purpose of the work we've just sketched so briefly so far is not to fixate on looking backwards nor inwards, but to build capacity to embrace practices of personal and political repair and transformation going forward. What we call restorative solidarity is a journey around and around the circle, doing our own work, reckoning with harms and responsibilities, and recovenanting and acting. Here are 4 areas of practice that we outline in the book, again, briefly, for becoming better treaty people, which is a phrase we borrow from Canadian Mennonite Roger Epp. Reschooling our colonial legacy and identity, building literacy, critical analysis, and imagination. Relationship building with Indigenous communities, especially our local or regional neighbors. Restorative actions that support work for Indigenous justice, and reparative experiments with resources we own, control, or influence. Of course, these same steps can involve solidarity work with any community, around any issue. So here are some brief examples of each aspect, drawing from some of our own stumbling experiments. Reschooling is an intentional strategy to curate spaces, disciplines, and communities that are willing to do the hard work of revising and reforming our settler identities in an ongoing way. This is not a one-time thing, nor can we get a decree or a grade. It's the way of discipleship and healing. So in our case, since 2002, we've worked at designing, organizing, and convening these kinds of reschooling spaces around the country under the slogan of working at intersection of seminary, sanctuary, streets, and soil.
Remember that.
While we've covered many different social issues, the last decade has seen us often focus on various aspects of decolonization. So a gathering like this one today at Prairie View is such a space. The challenge is how to institutionalize this space as an ongoing practice. A second step in restorative solidarity is relationship building with Indigenous communities, especially those closest to us, in order to best support and accompany local Native leaders in their work of education, advocacy, organizing, reconstruction, and healing and repair. We settlers must develop friendships, build trust, and learn to listen to what and how they are prioritizing. So we continue to work in ongoing relationships with Chumash leaders here in California and are currently supporting their efforts to secure cultural easements in a nearby land conservancy project.
But as a binational organization, we also need to have relationships in my home province of Saskatchewan. And one of our strategies during our annual summer sojourn to see family and friends there is to visit Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, home of elders Harry and Germaine LaFond. Harry accompanied my research a decade ago, and we have toured their reserve, co-led a retreat with them for activists there, enjoyed powwows, taken field trips together to other reserves, and we have also had the gift of hosting them here in California. Forging relationships, especially across historic gulfs of mutual alienation, suspicion, and ignorance, does not happen quickly. It takes patience and persistence. For settlers and guests, it is about showing up, listening, and learning. Harry and Germaine are masters of building intercultural literacy, and they emphasize that relationships are essential to genuine solidarity. Otherwise, our gestures are merely performative. The third R, restorative actions, is to support and engage in Indigenous initiatives for justice. Brenna Cusson is a young Catholic activist featured in Healing Haunted Histories who supports water protectors and pipeline resistors and annually attends the Women and Water Coming Together Symposium at a nearby Ojibwe reservation. Our book looks at a number of diverse ways of expressing solidarity. For Canadians, the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action provide a map for settlers and our institutions, including churches and mental health agencies, to follow.
This brings us to the fourth and ultimate step in restorative solidarity. Decolonization must organize toward restorative land justice. So the goal of our book's process is to animate concrete settler expressions of redistributive justice, reparations, and repatriation. We must never forget that the total land mass of both Canada and the US, Indigenous reserves and reservations constitute 0.2%. So the hashtag Land Back movement has highlighted this question and wider issues of sovereignty. So settlers must experiment with reparations, boldly, concretely, and repeatedly, remembering that ultimately this is in order to heal our own hauntings and become whole as well. Of course, talk of reparations spikes our settler anxieties, and our communities and institutions typically dismiss these as too complicated or unrealistic. But people of faith and conscience can and must think and organize together with Indigenous colleagues concerning power, money, and land justice. So here are a few personal, ecclesial, and political examples. Personal example which comes from your community and about which many of you, I believe, are familiar. Florence Schloniger is a Mennonite pastor and descendant of immigrants who settled Kansa land in the late 1870s. By 1846, 20 million acres of Kansa territory had been reduced to a mere 250,000. And in 1873, the tribe was forcibly removed altogether to Oklahoma. In the process of learning that history, Florence decided to give $10,000, a portion of her share of her family homestead's sale, to the Kansa Indigenous Heritage Society, an organization that works to maintain legacy and memory of the people for whom Kansas is named, provides settlers avenues to make things right. A small but significant land back project near Los Angeles involved a Jewish landowner who gave a mere acre of land back to a local Tongva group. And yet this was the first land back project in one of the largest metropolises in our country. We worked closely with one of this project's animators. It's a modest but hopeful initiative because the land is adjacent to a prominent park and neighborhood and thus very visible as an educational space. It's even more powerful, however, when institutions decide to make reparations. These have wider impact on other organizations and ultimately on the body politic. Today, many mainstream denominations face dwindling congregations and underused church buildings, and some parishes are closing their doors.
Stony Point Presbyterian Church in New York made this difficult decision in fall 2017, which led to a concrete gesture of repatriation. In 2016, the Presbyterian Church USA General Assembly repudiated the doctrine of discovery, and the General Assembly called on all levels of PCUSA to enter into dialogue, strategy, and action with Indigenous people of the region as part of a process of confession and repentance to redress wrongs. Our friend Rick Upper Chase, former denominational moderator, proposed to Stony Point Pres that they explore with local Indigenous leaders a possible handover of the property. Discussions with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Nation culminated in a November 2019 handover of the former Stony Point Church and all of its property to the newly created Sweetwater Cultural Center to promote the education, health, and welfare of Native peoples and to preserve their cultures and ceremonial practices. Today, Sweetwater is thriving, and we've been honored to collaborate in their program.
The realm of public policy things, of course, get more complicated, at least for our settler political imaginations. Recent grassroots experiments in voluntary taxation as civil society reparations are therefore a good place to start experimenting. The Sogoreate Land Trust is an urban intertribal organization led by Indigenous women in Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's working to rematriate urban land to Indigenous stewardship, with the priority being to procure land where Ohlone ancestors can be properly reinterred, since every one of the 425 shell mounds, sacred burial grounds around the bay, were destroyed by development, while the remains of over 15,000 Ohlone are locked away at local universities. Some local settlers, in consultation with Sogoreate, initiated the Shumi land tax, a voluntary payment that is both symbolic and substantive. Participants, including local churches and synagogues, calculate an annual tax based on their rent or mortgage. These funds directly support Sogoreate's work to acquire and preserve land, establish a cemetery, to reinter stolen Ohlone ancestral remains, and build urban gardens, community centers, and sacred arbors so current and future generations of Native people can thrive. Similar symbolic but substantive tax initiatives have sprung up around the country, including in Seattle, Northern California, and New York.
None of these examples of settler reparations are heroic. After all, modest redistributions of settler surplus are hardly costly to those of us with cultural and political privilege. Still, such experiments represent beginning steps in a longer journey, which will in turn inspire and equip more substantial efforts. No step is too small, and no step is too big. This work is best done in community, which helps us settlers deprivatize our anxiety and communitize our imagination. So what can we do together to move forward in the 4 R's of restorative solidarity? What steps will you take on your own? On this way, we'll have to get used to working with questions that have no easy answers, which is very difficult for us managerial-minded settlers. But the more we experiment with reschooling, relationship building, restorative actions, and reparations, the more we'll be able to metabolize such questions. Hayake Alfred sums it up this way. For all of us, Indigenous and settler alike, there is only self-questioning and embracing this commitment. Listen to the voices of our Indigenous ancestors, channeled through the young people of our nations. Learn from Indigenous culture how to walk differently and love the land as best you can. As settler discipleship of decolonization can, we believe, contribute to the healing of our haunted history and to the liberation of our hostage future. Lastly, we want to let you know about the new Healing Haunted Histories resources that will be available by the beginning of next year. We've been working on resources to support facilitators leading groups through the landlines, bloodlines, songlines process. And this consists of the new facilitators guide. This is the image of the front page here, supported by 9 short training videos highlighting key concepts and practices from each chapter, and then a participant workbook with exercises and worksheets. Friends, leaders at Prairie View graciously provided many of you with a copy of Healing Haunted Histories, and so I would love to encourage you to consider forming a group to study the process together and determine restorative solidarity action. Please let me know if you are interested in these new resources. Thanks so much for your time and attention, and now we will turn it back to Vicki.